All right, well, it is one after the hour. We're going to get going. So welcome. It's really lovely to have you here. My name is Tom Griffin. I'm assistant professor at the Ted Rogers School of Hospitality and Tourism Management. I'm also the assistant director of the Institute for Hospitality and Tourism Research. This seminar, this event is part of our Main Street Reimagined project, which myself and Dr. Walter Jameson have been working on, looking at ways for the BIA community and main streets in general to use the visitor economy to their advantage and to develop the visitor economy to find those benefits that it can bring. Today's event is on engaging Main Street residents and their visitors, and we'll get into that in just a minute. But first we'll do our land acknowledgement associated with the land that Ryerson University is built. So Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship and respect. So as I said, this is part of a project that's housed within the Institute for Hospitality and Tourism Research. And so our institute is basically an institute that seeks to do research that is of a scholarly value, but has application and use for industry. And it's also about trying to get our students experience and expertise and connections with the industries that we work in. So that's who we are. There's our website, htmresearch.ca. I encourage you to follow us and to keep in touch. And Walter, I'll let you introduce this part.
Thanks, Tom. Just before we get going formally, we just want to remind everyone that this session today is part of a larger initiative. I think most of you are aware that we have a handbook. We now have several sections that have been posted and more to come. Just to let you know that we recognize that the month of December is incredibly busy for people on main streets, and so we will be taking a brief holiday and coming back in January with 5 more sessions. What's really interesting is that we're now working with several people from the Main Street community as well as other development organizations. And so you'll see that the sessions that we'll be doing are going to be joint efforts between Ryerson and various stakeholders within the community. And we very much look forward to that. We encourage you to send us any feedback that you have on what we're doing or any topics that you think we could be covering that would be of relevance to you in reimagining your main streets. Okay. What we've decided to do today is, rather than have a formal presentation, is that Tom and I will be involved in a conversation. That conversation really is going to be me asking Tom a number of questions and for us to think more carefully about visiting friends and relatives. And we'll stop every once in a while and see if you have any questions or comments or examples of things that you think you would like to share with the larger community here on our Zoom call today. So please feel free to do that, but we will stop at various times to give you a chance to ask questions. For those of you who don't know, Tom has been working in the area of visiting friends and relatives for a considerable period of time and is now considered by many as one of the experts in the field in understanding its relationship to the larger field of tourism. And now Tom has been working at applying this to the visitor economy as it relates to main streets and BIAs. And we think that it's a really important area to explore. Tom has posted a section, an excellent section on this, and so there's more detail. But as with everything we're doing, if you have additional questions or comments, please feel free to get hold of Tom and I through our emails, and we'd be more than happy to work with you. And one of the things that we're going to be offering is, in some cases, putting together small group discussions if we feel there are enough people who want to explore something in more detail. So today is informal, and we hope that you choose to participate if you think that's appropriate. Tom, as we start, maybe it would be useful for you to spend a few minutes just telling us what you think visiting friends and relatives are. What is it, and why is it an important topic for us to be considering?
Absolutely. Thanks, Walter. So I think visiting friends and relatives is a really fascinating part of tourism broadly, because I think all of us in the tourism industry should be focused on using tourism and developing tourism to benefit our communities. And so when we start to think about, what types of tourism benefits our communities, and not just builds volume and spending, but that kind of fits with our communities, looking at visiting friends and relatives as a form of tourism and a form of the visitor economy is really intriguing because it requires resident involvement. And so for those of us that are in situations such as BIA's that are interested in developing our local community in a sustainable and consistent way, thinking about how we can engage visitors through our residents is a really kind of intriguing idea, because it gets us talking to not just visitors but also residents at the same time. And so I think it's a really kind of missed opportunity for many tourism and community-based organizations.
Good. Thanks, Tom. I just noticed, Tom, that we have somebody from South Korea on, Soo-hee, 3:00 in the morning. I trust that this is going to be worthwhile. Hello, how are you?
Hello.
I sympathize with you because I was based in Thailand for 20 years and very often was doing what you're doing, but the other way around. So I hope we keep you awake for a little while, Soo-hee. Welcome to you.
Thank you. Thank you for excellent invitation. I am also researching visiting friends and relatives, so I was very interested in this webinar. So
Great.
Yeah, welcome. It's great to have you here, Soo-hee. It's nice to we've communicated on email, but it's nice to see you.
Great. Tom, thank you for that, for giving us that introduction. I think one of the questions that we've been hearing is that what's different between tourism in general? You've sort of started to address that in your earlier comment, and the kind of visitor that we're talking about and the kind of activity that we're talking about right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing to think about is that this involves residents. And so residents in this situation become the attraction. First of all, visitors choose to visit a place because of a reason or a motivation. And when we typically think about tourism, we're thinking about entertainment and attractions and events and festivals that kind of draw people to a particular community. When we talk about visiting friends and relatives, it's the resident that's drawing people to that community. And so the resident becomes an attraction. And that's a really powerful attraction, that can kind of trump and override many other barriers and obstacles, and makes one community really appealing for, because of that specific relationship. And so every community, you don't need an iconic tower or a museum or a big tourism attraction. Every community has residents, and all residents as a population have connections to people from outside the community that they are already attracting to the area, and then they're influencing the behavior once they're in the community as well. And so, I think that's the main distinction is that it really involves residents as attraction, but also as guide to visitors in the community as well.
Right. The point that Tom brought out, that many times we may not recognize what our main streets may have that will be of interest to visitors. And we'll be sending you out in early December really a framework for beginning to better understand your Main Street from the perspective of the visitor. But every Main Street has a story, every Main Street has unique opportunities, and certainly many Main Streets are situated within communities that have special qualities and values. And so we always urge people to think about their Main Streets and their communities from the perspective of the visitor. But what's really interesting is, given what, Tom, you've been talking about, which is the fact that, at least from our point of view, we see this as an important dimension of helping Main Streets to become more successful and reemerge successfully from the pandemic. Why haven't we seen as much interest, do you think, either from Main Street groups or BIAs, and even from destination management organizations, about what we think is an important set of visitors that can help Main Streets?
Yeah, I mean, it's always surprising to me how little attention this particular part of the visitor economy has gotten in practice. I think there's a couple of main reasons. I think from a tourism perspective, many tourism organizations are really focused on hotel visitors. Hotel visitors often drive the funding for destination marketing organizations, and it's just part of the culture of, promoting tourism, is finding those visitors that spend most money, and this idea that people that stay in hotels spend most money and have most economic impact. I think another reason why it sometimes gets disregarded is because I think people just think it's happening anyway, that people are, they are inviting their friends and relatives to come and visit. They are doing things with them. And as an organization that might be interested in finding new visitors and new activity, this one seems to be relatively self-maintained, and perhaps we don't need to, we should spend our focus trying to get new visitors for different reasons. And I'd kind of come back at that with a couple of points. I mean, first of all, I think much of the economic activity that happens when visitors visit residents is often not counted properly. So if we think about a visitor visiting a resident, they often, not always, but they often stay for longer. They often shop and visit in places that are not, that are kind of outside the main tourism hubs. So they kind of disperse their spending a bit more. And they also, and this is the really important thing, is that they drive resident activity as well. I'm going to use my mum as an example a lot, right? But when my mum comes to visit me in my neighborhood of Toronto, I now spend my holiday time and, I might take some vacation time, and I might choose to stay in the local area rather than taking my vacation time and money elsewhere. And that's a really kind of powerful impact for the local community. And then the other point about not being, that we can't influence this behavior, I just don't think that's really been proven or tested substantially. So I really think that there have been a couple of examples, we'll get into those a little bit later, of destinations and communities engaging residents to attract visitors and affect what they do. And they appear to have some really kind of powerful impacts, not just economic, but also the social, cultural as well.
Thanks, Don. That's really useful. I think one of the things that we're struggling with and we'll be addressing in the new year is how do we begin to better understand the impact of the visitor economy on Main Streets in general, and then in certain sectors. And I think that's really important. If we're going to be able to make a case to governments and retailers and others, we need to have some data. And we would like to share some ideas with you that we're developing with others in the Main Street community about that topic. So thanks for bringing that up, Tom, that I think that's important. If I can just make a quick comment, what's really interesting is, and I won't mention particular organizations, but when Tom and I tried to talk about this earlier, before the pandemic, we got very little interest. And now what we see are that DMOs are beginning to recognize that this is an important part of the overall visitor market, that while it may not necessarily equal what a convention brings, the impact on the main streets, which is our concern, can be quite significant if we can make sure that visiting friends and relatives works in your main street. Tom, I'll ask you one more question, and we'll see if there's any questions or comments from our colleagues out in Zoom land. So given the fact that we've now been saying that there's still a low level of recognition about the importance of VFR, that we really think that there's a significant potential for it, Tom, what are ways that we can help inform residents about their local areas so that they can then, when they do have friends and relatives, that they can do so in a knowledgeable way?
Sure. I mean, my experience is that, yeah, for BIAs, of course, residents are the main market for everything that you do, and that makes a ton of sense, and I wouldn't suggest otherwise. However, I think that the expectation that speaking to residents and marketing to residents just about what they could do themselves, and then hoping that that translates into them inviting people to come and stay, or affects what the advice that they give their visitors, I'm sure there is an impact on that, but I would encourage BIAs, marketing agencies, to think about looking at the role that being a host actually, how it affects a person. And, I think about your own experience. When I see ideas of what to do in my own community, I'm thinking about that in my own life and what can I do with my family on my weekend to go and see in my local neighborhood. When I know that somebody's coming to stay with me, that positions me in a bit of a different role. First of all, I might start to think, well, actually there's a festival or an event going on and my friend from across the city would love this. I haven't seen them in a long time. I could use this to invite, Walter to come and see me in the East End of Toronto, because I know that Walter really loves this type of cuisine or this type of music or whatever it is. And so, knowing what my friends and relatives like and what's happening in my community might then trigger me to invite somebody. But also, if I know that somebody's coming to visit me and they've invited themselves, let's say, and there's not like a particular reason in the community that they're coming to see me, well, it might mean now that I'm thinking about, well, what can I do with this person now that they're coming to see me? And so then I might go, well, I know that Walter likes to eat this food, or, I know he really likes taking nice photos of scenery or whatever it is. And now I'm going to look for those things that Walter likes to do when he comes to visit me. And that might not be things that I necessarily myself am instantly drawn to. And so as a resident host, it now kind of encourages me to look at my local area with a different set of, a different lens, to say, well, how can I entertain somebody in this neighborhood? What is it about the place that I live that I kind of want to show off and want people to have a good experience of? Because, my neighborhood is an extension of my identity. I've chosen to live here. I've set up my home here. And when I have friends and relatives come to visit me, I want them to have a good time, because it's part of my identity that I've chosen to live in this place. And so I really kind of spend more effort and look for things that I think my guests are going to like, because I want them to have a good time. I feel kind of responsible for their experience.
Good, Tom, that's really very useful. And I think one of the things that I was hearing here is that while we group friends and relatives together, they can be quite different. In other words, we're not relatives, at least I'm not aware that we're relatives. But the fact that if you invite me out to your community on the Danforth means that I'm now going to an area which I may not have gone. Where you could say, rather than going to a restaurant somewhere else, why don't you come to my neighborhood? I've got a local place that I'd like to share with you. And then, of course, the opposite can happen, is that I can invite you to my neighborhood. And so I think it's always useful to say, well, we really don't have relatives visiting us very often, but all of us have networks across the city or across a region or whatever. And it's that idea that, we want to support our main street and at the same time provide friends with what we think is a unique opportunity experience. So I think that let's not lose sight of that. That's really an important part of it. Um, we've been going here for about 20 minutes. I wonder, does anyone have a comment or a question that they would like to ask?
So feel free to type into the chat, or of course you can always bring yourself off mute, and we're a small group. I think we can just take
Okay, we'll keep going, Tom, a little while, and hopefully we'll get some.
I
Tom,
think I saw,
one thing-
sorry, Walter, I think I
Yeah.
saw Jesse come off mute. Jesse,
Yeah, hey.
hi.
Well, recently I found that with the pandemic, there isn't many places to gather with friends. So working at Markham Village BIA, I kind of like to take inspo from the Toronto ones, kind of neighboring ones. I follow multiple, probably 20 plus of all Toronto BIAs. And when my friends want to hang out, I visit a few of these pages, see if there's any local events or any fun experiences, and kind of invite them through the quickest like DM. And then because the street, most of the BIAs have so much, the local thing to offer, that includes like a place to dine in already, a place to maybe knick-knack shop, grocery shopping. And I feel like that invite is a nice experience and kind of like a hangout day itself. I love doing that.
Great.
That's
Yeah.
fantastic.
Thanks, Jesse.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, and I think, Jesse, you're in Markham, and Alison, I think you're in Orangeville, if my memory is correct. And my experience of going to many places, I live relatively central downtown Toronto, but my experience of going to many places that are kind of an hour outside of Toronto are because of friends and relatives. It's because I've got people that I know that have moved there or work downtown and live there, and I go and see them for. That's my experience of going to the Blues Fest in Orangeville, is because I have friends that used to live around the corner and they moved to Orangeville, and they invite me every year to go to the Blues Fest, and it's become like an annual thing. And so that's that relationship. Without that relationship, it might not have been enough of a motivation or a hook to get me to that festival outside of Toronto. But because I have that relationship, it's taking me there. Thanks, Walter.
Yeah, really interesting that in some ways or another, we become almost like a trip advisor or something. That, I may not choose to go to Markham on my own, but if a friend of mine then says, look, there's a great experience to be had in Markham, BIA, I'll go, because already I'm going with a certain level of confidence that that person knows me, as Tom was saying, and knows what I'd like, and I'm going to go there where I might not normally. So I think the power is quite strong, as you were saying, Jesse, that just simply telling people about this amongst the people on your Facebook or Instagram or whatever is one way of helping to identify opportunities on main streets that, with all the choices that we have, we just may not do. And I think that's one of the important parts of it. So we're starting to build, I think, an idea that as hosts, the host plays a very important role in all of this in terms of making sure that this works. Tom, maybe we can just talk briefly then about what a host means, because we've talked about that, but can you just suggest how residents act as hosts?
Sure. I think it's really useful to think about the personal relationships that residents might have with the people that come to visit them. And we kind of touched on that a little bit about the difference between friends versus relatives. So when I host a friend, I'm going to behave in a different way than if I'm hosting my mum or my in-laws or whatever, right? And so the relationship that I have with the people that come to visit me then changes how I look at my neighborhood and the types of things that I might look to do with them. Who I am as well changes that. So, I think looking at the resident groups within your neighborhood, your community, and seeing, well, do I have, am I a university town? Because students will have a very different type of hosting capacity and activities that they're looking for than, say, a community that maybe has a high rate of retired people that might be attracting grandchildren and mixed generational families. Another key distinction that I found in my research is the length of time that you've spent in a place as a resident. Whether that's you're an immigrant from outside of Canada or you're a domestic migrant as well. And the general pattern is that the more recent you are in a community as a resident, the stronger ties that you have with people in your old home, and those stronger ties often lead to a greater frequency of hosting, more visits. And more activity. So the general pattern is people that have just moved to a place are more likely to have more visitors, and they're more likely to do things with those visitors as they show people around and get to know their community as well. And so looking at those patterns and those relationships, I think is a really kind of good way to put yourself in the shoes of and with the view of what that resident is looking to do as a host, depending on who they're visiting and their relationship with their community already. And we can see those differences kind of play out a little bit.
Thanks, Tom. You just brought up an interesting point that you mentioned students in university town. Parents are an important source of visitors, right? They
Absolutely.
come and help if the student is from out of town, parents will come and help them get settled, will visit them during the semester. It's really important to think about, as Tom was saying, that student may not know his community or her community as well. They may know where the students go, but they really haven't started to think about what their parents might like to experience. And so it's to help those students in some way or another to say, when your parents are coming, here are some unique opportunities. That's one area. The other one, I think, too, is we've been using host here largely as, inviting friends or relatives that we know. But for anyone that's used Airbnb, every one of these hosts is a different. They're inviting people to stay at their home or apartment, whatever it happens to be. And we had a great opportunity this summer. We stayed in Prince Edward County at a place, and our host could respond very quickly. It's raining. Here are things you can do. And I think that's another kind of host, but to try to think of those people as also part of our potential to use the visitor industry to help their community. And it just happened that this person had done her homework, but I've been in other situations where people are not as well aligned, and they'll often direct you to a community 3 away as opposed to their immediate environment. So it's also understanding that notion of host.
I just want to address Carly's written a comment in the comments, and so Carly says, are you suggesting that local DMOs start to market to the local resident population to help engage them in bringing friends and relatives? I mean, simply yes. I think absolutely. I think it's a real missed opportunity, and I think for BIAs as well. I think talking to residents as we know that you guys are hosts. We know you guys bring people to our community. We want you to bring more people to our community, and we want you to do more things when you are in our community. And finding the messaging to do that. And I think that's useful because, instead of trying to chase people who are visitors that are in distant places, all over the place, you now are talking to people in your backyard, in your community, that know who you are as an organization and know what your community has to some extent to offer. And so you're talking to them to leverage their relationships with the visitors, and or say, please bring more people more often. And when you are here, why don't you do more stuff? That's kind of the principal argument.
Really an important point. I think which means that we need to be more effective as Main Streets in making that case to DMOs who are being, asked for funding and support from a number of different sources. And so one of the things that we feel strongly about is having data of some kind or another that we can make our case that they should be devoting part of their energy to making this happen. And one of the interesting factors, and Tom, you touched on this briefly. If I own a restaurant in Markham, BIA, whether that person comes from, Toronto or from South Korea, it really, in some ways, doesn't make a whole lot of difference to the restaurant owner. That person is spending money and helping that business to survive. The difference, though, is that if the person from Markham, from Toronto, really likes the restaurant in Markham, they're going to be able to go back on a regular basis. So it's somehow or another, in some DMOs' minds, the visitor from away is somehow more valuable. I would argue in the case of Main Street, it may not always be the case. It's important, but just think about the fact that if you provide that visitor to the Markham BIA with a good experience, he or she and their family are likely to go back, where a visitor from somewhere else simply won't be able to. So it's part of that discussion that we need to have to show why we think this is important.
That's a really good point, Walt. I mean, as a community, would you rather have one person visit one time from the other side of the world that spends a ton of money, or would you rather have one person that comes once or twice a year for the next 20 years and is a more stable, less affected by seasonality and has a stronger relationship with your community? I mean, both have advantages and both have disadvantages, but just because somebody just visits for half a day doesn't mean that they're a low value, shouldn't be a low value visitor market, because they might come back.
And there's also the possibility that they tell their friends in their neighborhood or their community about the great experience that they had. So I think there's that fostering of this idea that the visitor is, we have different types of visitors, and you say, Tom, they have their different advantages.
And there's also there's a certain cachet of saying, the example I use sometimes is to say, I've just been to New York, and you can either say, well, I stayed in Times Square at the Holiday Inn and, did the full tourist route, or I stayed with a friend in Brooklyn and we went to the underground bars and we, saw the different. I mean, when I'm telling you that story, the weight and the excitement that you might place on my storytelling could change depending on whether I stayed in that hotel at Times Square or, went off and did the hipster trail of Brooklyn, right? With a local guide showing me all the cool things to do. And so, visiting friends and relatives create really powerful and trustworthy and authentic word of mouth marketing.
Great. Tom, can I just make a quick comment? It also raises the idea of host. So host is me inviting Tom to my community or my relative from London. That's one part. Host is the Airbnb type of host. But it's also a mindset, I would argue. Well, I want your comment, Tom. The comment that the Main Street Committee, BIA coordinator, whoever it happens to be, is also a host, because we want them to come to the Main Street and shop and, go to a restaurant or go to the festival. So that's another definition of host. And if you start to think about yourself as a BIA or a Main Street as a host, that means you're trying to provide an environment that's conducive to visiting friends and relatives. I think that's important.
Yeah.
And it's a mindset change.
It is a mindset change. Yeah.
One of the things that we always try to stress in when we're talking with people is we're not in any way arguing against the fact that the Main Streets, the BIA's important responsibility is to meet the needs of their local community. That's quite clearly the case. What we're saying is you must do that, and you must do that in the most effective way you can. But as you're doing that, can you increase the amount of visitors you're getting and therefore increase the opportunities for your businesses to do better because you're adding more customers? It's not a matter of saying we're going to not pay attention to our local residents. In fact, it's the opposite to say, and Tom, you've talked about this in an earlier session, that in some ways a visitor industry may in fact provide more opportunities for local residents. It may mean that if somebody's trying to invest in a restaurant and he sees that the other restaurants are quite busy and they've got lineups, and some of that lineup is because of visitors, that's somewhere where she may choose to come in and invest her money as opposed to somewhere else.
Right.
So it's a way of thinking about the fact it's another source of customers.
And just to build on that as well is so a number of ways to develop the visitor economy. So for example, you might say, let's start a new festival, or let's build a new attraction or something. If you're building that with the intent of bringing in visitors, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's very consistent with local interests and values, right? Like, we can try to do that. However, if we try to develop a visiting friends and relatives program where, as an organization, as a DMO or as a BIA, talk to our residents, say, bring your friends and family and do stuff with them, then the consequences of that will be activity that is in line with and more consistent with residents' interests and values. So let's say there's a casino in your neighborhood, right? If the residents don't like the casino, they won't take their friends and family there. If there is, a certain type of nightlife, residents will not support those types of businesses and develop the visitor economy in that way. They'll find things that they want to do that they like. And so, it kind of develops local businesses that serve visitors more in line with resident values and interests.
Carly, I see that you have a question here. Are there reliable data sources for the dollar amount spent? I just was talking earlier about this. This is something that Tom and I are working with our colleagues and with some other people with a strong interest in BIAs to be able to come out and talk about this knowledgeably. I think it's fair to say that this has not been done very well, if at all. And one of the things that we need to recognize is that all of you in Main Streets have limited capacity. You're expected to be doing so many other things. And so one of the things that we want to develop and then develop with you when we have some initial ideas is what data can we collect on a regular basis that helps us to know how well we're doing, whether our marketing is working or whether our retail mix is right or whatever the issue might be. And so we think that's an important part of what we're doing. It's not to say that we'll necessarily have the answer, but what we'd like to do is to begin to suggest data sources and how you collect them and how you measure them that can meet your own needs within your Main Street, but also you can use as an argument where more attention, more resources should be paid. So stick with us on this one. We will be doing something after the new year that at least will get that conversation going. So we promise you that very early in 2022.
I'll just throw one stat in there, Walter, if that's okay. So
yeah.
In 2016, it's a little bit old, but I did a survey of more than 2,000 Greater Toronto area residents and found that about 80% of them had hosted a friend or relative from out of town. So it's a smaller group, right? If you talk about Toronto anyway, and you say in-town hosting, which I'm sure many BIAs would be interested in Toronto. But anyway, 80% of respondents had hosted an out-of-town friend or relative in the last 3 years. And of those 80%, almost 80%, 78%, had taken at least one paid vacation day to host. And so it's hard to sort of put a value on how much money as a host do you spend, because if I could take Walter to a restaurant, it might be a restaurant I would have gone to anyway. So it's hard to add that kind of, is this additional money for that restaurant or not? So we looked at vacation days.
Yeah.
But on average, people had taken 6.5 vacation days in the last 3 years to host a friend or relative in their own community. So
and that's the kind of data that's the kind of data we need. Tom, the time is moving along here very quickly. I'm going to move ahead on one of the questions that I think is key.
Yep.
All right. So you're a Main Street, you're a BIA, you want to engage your residents as hosts. And Tom, you've got some great ideas, and I didn't want to lose that. Can you share those with us in terms of what you think a BIA or a Main Street could be doing to engage residents as hosts?
Sure. I think there's two kind of main categories here that I might advocate for. The first is kind of like a general relationship building messaging to residents to say, You know, residents, we love you. You're our friends. You are our family. We know that you bring friends and family to our community, and we thank you for that, and we want to help you do that. And we're proud of the community that we have, and we want to help you continue to show off what a great place that we live in, right? And just that kind of inserting that type of messaging into communications and marketing and promotion, just to kind of build that foundation of, you know, we live in a great place and we want to share it with people, and we want to help you share it with the people that you care about. A second kind of more retail focused idea is really a kind of play on the old passport idea. You know, where somebody registers, they get some kind of passport, and you go to different shops and businesses and you get some kind of deal or discount in that way. With some effort, of course, but setting up a system where, as a resident, if I could register as a host somehow, and when I show up to local restaurants or bars or shops or markets, if there was some kind of special experience or value that I could get if I show up with somebody from out of town. So, you know, me and my friend, we show up together, and I can show you that I'm a host, and maybe we get an off-the-menu cocktail that is kind of special for us. Maybe it's that we get to speak with the chef for a few minutes, or whatever it is that adds some kind of value and special experience to me showing up with my guest. Because that would do a couple of things. It would make me feel special as a resident in your community. Wow, you guys are, like, you're helping me look good in front of my friend and family, right? Like, I can give my guests this kind of special experience. You know, that makes me feel kind of more connected to the community and the specific business where I'm at. It's also for the guest, it gives a really memorable experience. You know, if you can say when you go home, I went to visit Tom in East Toronto and we had this amazing special experience because we were a host and guest. That creates a really powerful word of mouth marketing, and more likely that people will repeat and come back as well. And so I think those are kind of like the two broad categories of ideas that I have. And of course would vary depending on the community.
Yeah, what's important, and Tom and I have talked about this, is really what's in it for the host. I guess that's one of the things. Why should I try to support a local enterprise in my community as opposed to going to the Italian restaurant 3 communities away? And so I think it's always trying to say what's in it for them. So whether it's a passport, a discount, a free dessert, whatever it happens to be, part of that too means I'm not going to take somebody to somewhere I haven't been. Right? You always want to. And so I think that's part of thinking about the fact that each resident that goes and uses something within your main street is a potential person to bring more people in. And so I always try to think of it that way. One other quick point is I just wanted to point out that while we've talked retail, it's not only retail, right? It can be a festival or event that is going on in your community and we'll talk more about this in another session, but at the very least, if your event, and Tommy, you were using the music festival as an example, where you may not normally go to a community, but you will go to this, then in effect, you're a visitor to that main street, to that community. And so therefore, those are incredibly important things to bring people in. And so if you want to, the attraction may be the festival, but then the retail shop or the restaurant may do better. It's also a way too, though, maybe for some of your community initiatives to benefit. And we talked about this a little bit in After 6, that it may provide a new audience for your theater group, where not enough people within your community to support it. But if you tie this in with a restaurant partnership, maybe it provides additional income, additional people to listen to your choirs or whatever it happens to be. And so there's also that social cultural dimension. So we don't want this to only seem to be economic, at least in the first instance, but we all recognize that there can be secondary benefits in terms of spending. So I think that's something to think about. Tom, I'm not seeing anything here, but before we leave, can you show your Melbourne? I
Yeah,
mean, Tom showed this to me last week, and I thought it was dynamite. Let's just share it with us.
so this is, I often get asked if there are examples of a visiting friends and relative campaign. And there aren't many, but this is one that I'm aware of and that has a really powerful message. And it's not totally relevant to all BIAs, but I think just what's really powerful here is identifying the relationship that residents have with potential visitors and playing on that relationship to encourage people to visit and do stuff. It's less than 2 minutes long. Walter, will you just give me a thumbs up or thumbs down if the sound is not working?
Okay.
Thank you. And so I just love that example because it really on that relationship that residents have. And so, I encourage anyone on this call that's with the BIA, what's the relationship that residents in your community have with potential people outside? Are they immigrants and talking to people far away? Are they, if you're in a suburban area and you've got new families that have left from the city and that they've just moved to your area and now they want to have a housewarming barbecue, or they want to bring their father-in-law down to help build the new deck or whatever it is, there's a possible powerful relationship that you can play on. If you are a place that has second home owners, if you're in cottage country or whatever, playing on that idea of having, I guess, many guests taking advantage of your stay, and playing on that kind of relationship in a comical, humorous way could be one way to kind of think about engaging this type of visitor activity that is embedded and founded in resident interests and activity and connection to the community that will have that ongoing relationship and that ongoing impact even after the visitor's gone home. So that kind of like summarizes and captures quite a lot of interesting ideas for me.
As a senior citizen, I really enjoyed that one because we all have trouble with our children. And I like the fact of making believe you don't know your kids when they call you. But the important part of this one, I think, Tom, is it's a great example, but it also is the creativity that goes with it. And I think that we need to accept the fact that maybe some of the things that we've tried before may not work as well. But this one was brilliant in terms of that creativity, in terms of raising their message. If anyone runs into anything like this, I wonder if you could either let Tom or myself know about this. And our promise is we will get it out to the larger group that we're dealing with. But that is something that we hope is that we're helping to establish a small community here that share a common set of concerns and ideas. So thank you for sharing that, Tom. And anything that you do have, we'd be more than interested in hearing from you. I have one last question, Tom, unless anyone else out there wants to make a comment. Okay, one last question, Tom, as we're going to run out of time. So we've been talking a lot about it helps the retail sector, it can help social and cultural activities. You briefly talked about what it can do in a more social cultural way. And you mentioned this, but I wonder if you could just comment briefly, what are the implications of this kind of visitor activity? Because I think that if we accept the idea that Main Street is an idea, right? It's a social, cultural, economic thing that brings people together and has special meaning. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that being a host requires you or encourages you to look at your community in a new way, in an unusual way that you might normally do, and it's looking at the routine in a kind of new light, and I think it encourages you to look for the exciting things to do. To say, I'm going to entertain this person in my community. What should I do with this person? And it changes how you, rather than just looking at the place where you live as how am I going to get my groceries and get to work today, you're looking at it to say, how am I going to entertain people in this place? What is it that's special and fun about this place? So as a resident, it encourages me to change how I feel and look at the place where I live. If I host people that have specific interests, it encourages me to look for different things that I wouldn't normally do. Or if I have people come to visit me at times that I'm not used to, it encourages me to look at, well, what is going on in my neighborhood right now that I could possibly take people to have a look at. There are also a lot of social implications that are perhaps not so exciting for tourism marketing, but many people receive emotional support, receive childcare, and get that connection with their friends and family when they come to stay with them, and that can free up. In my research from a while ago, a lot of immigrants would have their parents come to stay with them to look after their children, and when they came to look after their young children, that allowed them opportunity to do more stuff in their own communities, whether that was going to school, going out for a meal with their partner that they weren't able to do beforehand, right? And so it's a really powerful resource that otherwise is very expensive and hard to find too. And if you're a festival or an event and you have residents and their guests coming to you, whether you're a festival event or a restaurant, it puts your business and your experience as the background to this refresh of a relationship, right? So I see my mum every couple of years, and where we spend our time together has a really, that becomes the backdrop and associated with my relationship with my mum, and that has a really powerful ongoing connection to those different places. And so it can be quite subtle, but I think if you think about kind of like growing roots into your community, it helps residents feel connected and established because they're sharing that place with their friends and relatives.
Thank you, Tom. That's really very strong. One of the things that we'll be sending out to you, as I mentioned earlier, is way of mapping. And one of the things that's important then, and just to underline what Tom was saying, is as we're acting as hosts, how good are we at doing it? Is it easy to navigate the main street? Is there a place to park? Are there bathrooms? What are the things that we normally think about? And so we'll look forward to your feedback on our mapping exercise, but it's really a way of beginning to think differently and what do we do to not only make the main street better for the visitor, but also for the people in the community. Are there any other comments that people might have? We're always available.
Questions or comments?
Yeah,
I'd love
I'm
to.
not seeing. If you have examples, please send them to us. We will come back to this, that, as we further develop the handbook, these themes will come back and we'll be bringing them together to be able to demonstrate how these things work effectively together. Okay, we're right on time. I'd like to thank you all for choosing to spend part of your day with us. We know you're busy. We know you got lots of other things to do, and we do very much appreciate your choosing to spend some time with us. We hope our ideas are useful. Welcome feedback at any time. And certainly on our collective behalf, I'd like to thank Tom for putting up with my questions and providing us with his experience based on a significant amount of solid original research he's done on this particular area. So thanks very much, Tom.
Thanks, Walter. Thanks everybody for attending, and I'm happy to, if this is ever something that you're curious about talking more, I'm always happy to have a chat and share some ideas. Great. Thanks everyone. Sign up for our newsletter and we'll have a new event in about 2 weeks.